By late October of that year, the Midwest welcomed the first bitter wind of the season, accompanied by a freezing rain that lashed against the brick facades of the older buildings. The corridors of the regional medical center smelled sharply of antiseptic. The clattering of stretcher wheels against the linoleum floors echoed with a hollow dryness that made my heart shrink. My name is Alana. I am 37 years old and serve as the vice president of accounting for a commercial real estate firm in Cleveland, Ohio. I have been married for 12 years to Vaughn, a 39-year-old senior project manager at a civil engineering firm. We have 2 children, Declan, who is 10, and Sloan, who is 7. My father-in-law is Harlan, a 70-year-old widower. My mother-in-law passed away 8 years ago. Harlan lives alone in a traditional single-story ranch house on the outskirts of Marysville, Ohio. Behind his property sits his old custom cabinetry shop and 6 industrial warehouses that he leases out. The drive from Cleveland to his town is about 120 miles. It is not an insurmountable distance, but you cannot exactly get there in the blink of an eye. Harlan has 3 children. The eldest is Garrison, 46, who owns a construction supply depot about 5 miles from his father's house. The middle child is Bridget, 43, married and living in downtown Columbus, roughly a 20-minute drive away. Vaughn is the youngest. 3 weeks before he was set to be discharged, while sweeping his back patio, my father-in-law suffered a severe angina attack. Mrs. Higgins, his neighbor, heard the broom clatter to the ground, ran over, and found him sitting on the porch steps, deathly pale and clutching his chest. She immediately called Garrison and got another neighbor to rush Harlan to the Ohio State University Medical Center. Garrison did show up to fill out the admission paperwork. No one denies that. But after that first day, his visits dwindled to just a few rushed minutes. Sometimes he barely warmed the chair before his cell phone rang and he was on his feet. He would tell his dad that the doctors and nurses were there to help and that he had to get back to the depot because he had people waiting. My father-in-law never reproached him, simply nodding and saying that business comes first and he should go with peace of mind. Bridget went to see him 2 afternoons, bringing a thermos of homemade chicken noodle soup and some fresh oranges. She would sit at the foot of the bed and ask how he was doing, but before an hour had passed, she was already glancing impatiently at her Apple Watch. She would announce she had to go pick up her son Kellen from baseball practice, adding that if he needed anything, he should just call Garrison. Harlan would nod again. He told her to go take care of his grandson. Vaughn called from Cleveland more often than his siblings. He wired money to cover some out-of-pocket medical expenses, spoke with the attending physician over the phone, and called his dad every night. He always sounded considerate, explaining he was closing a massive project and promising to visit as soon as it blew over. But during those 3 weeks, that vague promise kept receding like the tide. I could not go down immediately because my firm was closing out the 3rd quarter, so I asked for the number of the charge nurse. I called every day to speak with Kinsley, a nurse with a soft voice and meticulous habits. She would reassure me, telling me Harlan had eaten half his mashed potatoes and his blood pressure was stabilizing. I would ask if he had experienced any nausea the night before, or confirm that his medication dosage had been adjusted. Kinsley was always a bit surprised by my memory. I would laugh and explain I was an accountant, used to keeping track of numbers, and that I did not dare make a mistake with my father-in-law's medication. From then on, Kinsley alerted me to any changes. I paid the extra hospital fees, requested low-sugar meals, and arranged for fresh, warm towels and clean clothes to be delivered to his room. I did it all quietly, believing that when you are family, you do not need an audience to applaud you. The morning he was scheduled for discharge, I was sitting in a board meeting when my phone vibrated 3 times. Seeing Kinsley's number, I excused myself and stepped out into the hallway. Kinsley told me Harlan was being discharged that day, already dressed, but no family member had shown up to take him home. I panicked and asked about Garrison. Kinsley said she had been calling him since 8 in the morning, but Garrison claimed he was waiting on a massive freight delivery from Chicago. When she called Bridget claimed her son had a fever. I swallowed hard and asked about my husband. There was a heavy silence on the line before Kinsley replied. She told me Vaughn said he had a pitch with investors he absolutely could not miss, and he had asked if the hospital had a service to arrange an Uber Black to send his dad home. I froze in the middle of the corporate hallway. Inside the boardroom, my colleagues were still debating a discrepancy in the quarterly reports, but all I could picture was my father-in-law sitting alone with a plastic bag full of pill bottles. I asked where he was right then. Kinsley told me he was sitting in a chair by the door of his room. All the other patients on his floor had already left with their families. She said he kept muttering that maybe he should just rent a car to drive himself home, so as not to bother the kids. That phrase, about not bothering the kids sounded so fragile, yet it dropped like a lead weight on my chest. I immediately called Vaughn. He answered on the fourth ring, whispering that he was about to step into the meeting and telling me to make it fast. I tried to keep my voice steady. I asked if he knew his dad was being discharged today. He casually said yes, he had spoken to the nurse. He added that Garrison lived close by, so it was only logical for him to handle it. I retorted that Garrison was waiting on a truck, Bridget was using a sick kid as an excuse, and his own bright idea was to throw an old man in an Uber. I demanded to know whose father he actually was. Vaughn let out an annoyed sigh. He told me not to use that tone with him, insisting he was actually working. He claimed he had spent a month prepping for this pitch, and that canceling would screw over his entire team. I reminded him he had a deputy director and could delegate. He argued it was not that simple. I looked through the glass wall of the boardroom, seeing my subordinates waiting for me. I lowered my voice. I asked him if it were my father sitting abandoned at a hospital door. Would he tell me to pay a stranger to drive him home? Vaughn fell silent. I waited for him to say he would figure it out, but after a few seconds, he just told me I was making a mountain out of a molehill. He said his dad just needed to get home and it was not a life or death emergency. A chill ran down my spine. To him, an elderly man fresh off a cardiac event navigating a solo ride home was a trivial detail. He told me to calm down. I smiled bitterly. I told him everyone in his family was way too passive, so passive that nobody ever lifted a finger. I hung up. I requested emergency personal leave from my director and called my mother. I asked her to pick the kids up from school because I had to drive down to Marysville to get my father-in-law. My mother sounded shocked, asking if literally no one from his own blood family could do it. I watched the rain lashing against the office windows and replied that apparently they all had more important things to do. I did not know what my father-in-law was thinking at that exact moment. All I knew was that near 11 in the morning, at the end of a long hospital corridor, a 70-year-old man dressed in his Sunday best had packed his medications into a tote bag and sat waiting in front of a closed door. Meanwhile, his 3 biological children blindly believed someone else would swoop in to do the heavy lifting. I went back into the meeting room, apologized to my boss, and packed up my laptop. A coworker quietly asked if it was a family emergency. I nodded, saying my father-in-law was being discharged and nobody had gone to pick him up. I did not need to add anything else. I drove home, threw some comfortable clothes, motion sickness pills, and a fleece blanket into my trunk. I swung by the elementary school, pulled Declan and Sloan out early, and dropped them at my parents' house. Declan looked worried and asked where I was going in such a rush. I told him I was going to get Grandpa. He asked why Dad was not going with me. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and said Dad was busy. The 10-year-old went quiet for a moment before saying Grandpa must be really sad. Hearing a child realize that put a massive lump in my throat. My mother was waiting on her porch. Seeing me, she ushered me under the awning. She asked if I was sure about driving all that way alone in this weather and told me to take it slow, assuring me the kids would sleep over. Then she looked right at me and asked if Vaughn was seriously not coming. I shook my head. She did not criticize her son-in-law in front of the kids, but she simply stated that work is always urgent, but aging parents do not wait until our schedules are clear to get sick. That sentence rode shotgun with me the entire trip. Driving south out of Cleveland on Interstate 71, the rain began to pour heavily. The wipers were on maximum speed, the tires hissing over the slick asphalt. The GPS read 120 miles. Normally it would take under 2 hours. But that day, every passing minute gnawed at my patience. I had barely covered 30 miles when Garrison called me. He demanded to know if I was actually driving down. I confirmed I was on my way. His tone turned abrasive instantly. He said he had already told everyone he would organize something for the afternoon. He accused me of making it look like they had abandoned their father. I told him I had not said a word to anyone. He shot back that I did not need to say it, because my actions were making them all look ridiculous. I answered firmly. I told Garrison his father was sitting in a hospital waiting area. I said the person making them look ridiculous was not the one driving down to pick him up. Garrison gritted his teeth, yelling that he had a flatbed truck loaded with thousands of dollars of materials waiting on him and that, as an accountant, I should understand logistics. I reminded him his depot had a floor manager and forklift operators, but his father only had 3 children. I told him not to lecture me. He sneered, saying if I wanted to win the Daughter-in-Law of the Year award, I should just go. I took a deep breath, said I did not want any awards, and only wanted someone there to open the car door when Harlan walked out of the hospital. Garrison stayed quiet for a few seconds and hung up. Less than 10 minutes later, a text popped up from Bridget. She swore her son actually had a fever and begged me not to think it was an excuse. I was just about to reply when an Instagram notification popped up on my screen. It was a photo from the grand opening of a boutique perfumery in the Short North District. Bridget was standing next to a massive floral arrangement, wearing an emerald green dress, holding a glass of champagne, and flashing a dazzling smile. The photo was time-stamped at 10 to 10 that morning. I took a screenshot and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. Whoever chooses to lie always has another lie ready to cover the first one. Passing through the rolling hills near Mansfield, the rain slowed, but the wind was fierce. I called Kinsley, the nurse. I asked how Harlan was doing. She said he was physically fine but kept asking if anyone had arrived. She had tried to get him to eat some pudding, but he refused, claiming he was afraid of getting carsick. In the background, I heard my father-in-law's voice. He was telling Kinsley to stop calling us, saying if everyone was busy, she should just get him the number for a cab company. Kinsley whispered into the phone, asking if I heard that. I bit my lip. I told her not to tell him I was on my way, to just tell him to wait a little longer. If he knew I was driving down from Cleveland, he would feel incredibly guilty and insist on leaving alone. I remembered the time Harlan came up to Cleveland to watch the kids. Sloan was running a dangerously high fever, Vaughn was stuck on a business trip in Chicago, and my mother was bedridden with sciatica. With one single phone call, my father-in-law got on the very first Greyhound bus of the morning, carrying a cooler packed with a pot of homemade chicken stew and herbal remedies. He always used to say that when family calls, you show up, or else you spend your whole life calculating who lives closer. And now, that same man was forced to wait because his 3 children were running the math on whose turn it was to bear the burden. By 11:30, I pulled into the medical center's parking garage. I ran through the main lobby, scanning the signs for the cardiology wing. The corridors on the 3rd floor were mostly empty now. The surrounding rooms were already being cleaned. Harlan was sitting on a hard plastic chair pushed against the wall. He was wearing an old brown button-down shirt and a thin cardigan. At his feet sat a canvas bag stuffed with clothes, his pill bottles, and a wooden-handled umbrella. He was not looking at his phone. He was just staring blankly down the long hallway. Every time he heard footsteps, he would lift his gaze slightly, only to drop it back down with painstaking slowness. I stood frozen for a few seconds, feeling my heart crack. I called out to him. He startled, turned around, and upon recognizing me, turned to stone. He asked what on earth I was doing there. I walked over, forcing a smile, and said I came to get him. He asked why I would do that, demanding to know if I had driven all the way from Cleveland. I told him 120 miles was nothing, and joked that it was not like I had crossed state lines. He let out a low chuckle, but his eyes immediately went red. He turned his face toward the window, quickly wiped his eyes, and started scolding me. He reminded me I had a demanding job and kids to handle. He insisted he could have easily taken an Uber. I crouched down to grab his canvas bag. I told him if I let him take a cab, my mother would chew me out tonight. I joked that she would question what kind of daughter-in-law I was to let a sick man ride home alone. He shook his head, muttering that my mother was always so dramatic. Kinsley stepped out of the nurse's station holding a clipboard. She sighed in relief, saying she was glad I finally made it. She mentioned Harlan had asked 3 times if anyone called, and even asked for a private ambulance company's number so he would not be a nuisance to the hospital staff. Harlan looked incredibly embarrassed, grumbling that the nurse talked too much. I took the discharge papers and listened to Kinsley's instructions. The blood pressure pill after breakfast, the heart medication exactly on schedule. If the chest pain returned, it was an immediate trip to the emergency room. I snapped a photo of the prescriptions, jotted down the schedule, and asked about his diet. Kinsley leaned in and whispered that she felt much better knowing I was the one taking over, noting he had barely spoken for days. I turned to my father-in-law and laid down the law. No skipping meals, and he had to follow the doctor's orders to the letter. He smiled, pointing out I had not even gotten him out of the building yet and I was already bossing him around. I reminded him I was an accountant, and if the numbers did not balance, I demanded explanations. I took him down to the cafeteria, bought him a cup of hot broth, forced him to swallow a few spoonfuls, and helped him to the elevator. He walked slowly. The hand he rested on my arm felt light, yet it trembled. On every floor, when the elevator doors opened, other families stepped in, chatting, holding up their sick relatives, carrying bags, or reminding each other about pharmacy runs. Harlan watched them in complete silence. When we reached my SUV, I opened the passenger door, adjusted the seat, and draped the fleece blanket over his knees. I buckled his seatbelt and double-checked the bag of medications. I asked if he was uncomfortable or having trouble breathing. He said no, just told me to pull out of the garage slowly. I walked around the front of the car and climbed into the driver's seat. As I put the key in the ignition, Harlan suddenly grabbed my wrist. His hand was ice cold. He checked the side mirror, as if making sure no one was lingering nearby. His face, which had relaxed slightly when he saw me, grew incredibly tense again. He called my name. I asked if he felt sick or if he wanted to go rest at his best friend Vernon's house instead. He shook his head and leaned in closer. He told me not to take him home. I froze. I thought I had misheard him. He opened his canvas bag, slid his hand under his discharge papers, and pulled out a piece of paper folded into quarters. It had an address in downtown Columbus, a phone number, and the name of an attorney. Harrison Vance. He placed the paper in my hand. He told me they were waiting for him and that he had been preparing this. I held the paper with freezing hands. I killed the engine and turned to face him. I asked him to explain. I reminded him he was just discharged from the cardiac wing, he was weak, and legal proceedings were not something to be done on a whim. He leaned back against the headrest and took a slow, deep breath before answering. He said he knew I thought he was losing his mind, but this was not something he dreamed up that morning. I asked if Vernon or this attorney was pressuring him. He stated firmly that no one pressures him. I told him to call the attorney right in front of me then. Harlan did not look angry. Instead, a look of profound relief washed over his face. He said I was doing the right thing, noting that in important matters, the person who trusts blindly is the one you have to worry about. He dictated the number. I put the call on speakerphone. On the second ring, a voice answered. Harlan announced he was discharged and that his daughter-in-law was bringing him over. The voice on the other end, Harrison, confirmed he was at the closing attorney's office with Vernon and asked how Harlan was feeling. I intervened. I introduced myself and asked how long this had been in the works. Harrison greeted me politely. He explained that Harlan had contacted him 12 days ago. He had requested a full audit of his assets and wanted to structure a transfer that allowed him to maintain control and legal right of use while he was still alive. Vernon had been tasked with retrieving the original documents from a safe. Harrison clarified that they would only proceed today if the senior closing attorney determined Harlan was in full possession of his mental faculties and acting voluntarily. I asked if he had met privately with my father-in-law. Harrison confirmed he had visited the hospital twice alone, once to take notes on his wishes, and once to explain the severe legal consequences of his choices. He added that he had advised Harlan not to sign anything in a hospital room because they needed an impartial, professional environment. Harrison made it clear that I had the right to refuse, and no one was forcing me to sign anything, but Harlan wanted me to hear the full proposal before I made a decision. I thanked him and ended the call. I turned to my father-in-law and asked what exactly he was planning to give me. He looked straight ahead and listed them off. The main house, the cabinetry shop, the industrial warehouses, the back orchard, and the large commercial lot near the industrial park. He rattled it off without missing a beat. I asked if he knew what all that was worth. Over $1.5 million. I opened the car door and stepped out into the parking garage. I paced a few steps, then got back in. I told him I would not accept it. He did not look surprised. He said he knew I would say that. I told him I drove down because I was his daughter-in-law. I pointed out that if I drove him straight from a hospital bed to a law office to absorb his entire estate, his family would crucify me. I asked what Garrison and Bridget would think. I told him even Vaughn would doubt my intentions. Harlan slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and tried to step out of the car. I reached out to help, but he gently swatted my hand away. He asked for a moment to just stand on his own 2 feet. He watched the cars pulling out of the garage, and his voice deepened. He said he was not giving it to me as payment for a car ride, even though nobody would believe that now. That was why he drew up the paperwork days before his discharge. I shook my head, arguing that having the papers ready did not change the fact that I was only his daughter-in-law. He turned to me and stated that a daughter-in-law is not just a stranger. The lump in my throat returned. He went on to explain the history. 8 years ago, after my mother-in-law passed away, he sat down with his 3 children in an attorney's office to divide her portion of the estate. Her part was crystal clear. Garrison received a plot of land near the state route and $50,000 to jumpstart his business. Bridget received $80,000 to buy her downtown condo. He helped Vaughn with $80,000 for our down payment in Cleveland. Everything else left over. The 3 kids signed away, agreeing it belonged exclusively to Harlan. I told him it was still a massive amount of wealth, so large that it needed to be left to someone who knew how to manage it. I asked if he even had enough cash left to survive on. He said he had $60,000 in personal savings. The machinery, the lumber, his work truck, and the operating capital for the cabinetry shop remained his. The rental income from the warehouses was excluded from the initial transfer as well. I asked if he had calculated all this out. He chuckled, saying he was not stupid enough to hand over his life's work and sit around waiting for his kids to hand him an allowance for his heart pills. That sentence made me smile, even as my eyes watered. We got back into the car, but I did not start the engine. He asked me what I was most afraid of. I told him I was afraid they would brand me a gold digger. I paused, deciding to be brutally honest. I told him I was terrified of shattering the family. Garrison would think I stole his birthright as the eldest son. Bridget would scream that he favored a daughter-in-law over his own flesh and blood. And Vaughn, my own husband, might force me to legally renounce the properties just to keep the peace at Thanksgiving. Harlan smiled a very sad smile. He told me I knew my husband better than he thought. He opened his canvas bag and pulled out a stack of certified copies. It was the inheritance partition deed, old bank wire receipts, and property tax records all in his name. He told me to look at them, assuring me he was not stripping any of his children of their rightful share to give it to me. I flipped through the pages. The numbers matched exactly what he had just explained. When I finished reading, he looked at me and asked a series of questions. He asked if I was absolutely certain that if he handed the deeds for the shop and warehouses to Garrison, Garrison would not immediately mortgage them to the hilt. I did not answer. He asked if I was sure Bridget would not force him to sell the farmland to recoup the money her husband secretly invested in Garrison's failing business. I snapped my head up and asked what money he was talking about. He waved his hand and said he would explain later. Then he asked the final question. He asked if he made Vaughn the sole title holder. Was I absolutely sure Vaughn would have the spine to say no when his siblings cornered him? I desperately wanted to defend my husband, but the memory from just a few hours ago was painfully fresh. Vaughn was not an evil man, but whenever conflict arose in his family, his default setting was to shut his mouth, wait it out, and hope I would be the one to cave. I whispered that I was not sure. Harlan looked down at his bony, wrinkled hands. He said he was not sure either, and an estate this size could not survive on a maybe. I put the car in drive and headed toward the address on the paper. It was an upscale historic building in downtown Columbus. Vernon was waiting for us under the grand entryway alongside a man in a sharp gray suit and glasses. Vernon asked Harlan how the body was holding up. Harlan grunted that he was not headed for the dirt just yet. Vernon frowned, noting he was fresh out of the cardiac ward but still had the same foul temper. The attorney, Harrison, escorted us into a private conference room. Resting on a heavy oak table were 4 sealed envelopes, each labeled with the name of a property. I did not sit down immediately. I asked Harrison if my father-in-law could change his mind at any point. Harrison confirmed that before signing anything, Harlan could halt the entire process, and I could reject the offer entirely. Even after signing the public deed with the closing attorney, the formal recording with the county would still need to be processed. I turned to Harlan. I told him I was only there to listen, and I was not promising to sign a single page. He nodded, asking only that I listen until the very end. Harrison opened the first folder. I saw the title abstracts for the main house, the cabinetry shop, the industrial warehouses, the orchard, and the commercial lot. I looked at Harlan and asked again why he picked me. Harlan held my gaze. He told me I had been in this family for 12 years. He recalled a time he asked me to audit the rental ledgers for the warehouses. I had tracked every single penny. He remembered that if the accounts were off by $5, I called him to make up the difference, but I never pocketed a dime. He pointed out that when he was admitted to the hospital, I asked the nurses about his medication dosages before I ever asked about the medical bills. And today, I had dropped everything and raced down the highway without having any clue he was going to hand me a fortune. He paused, his voice growing rough. He told me he did not choose me because I was the most submissive. He chose me because, out of his 3 kids, I was the only one who asked what he wanted before asking where he kept the property deeds. I lowered my head. Those words only made the weight on my shoulders heavier. I laid out my terms. I said if there was a single discrepancy proving he was not lucid, or a single clause that was murky, I would walk away. I added that I would refuse everything if he did not legally reserve enough cash for his medical care and the irrevocable right to live in his home until his last day. Harlan agreed. I then demanded that the senior closing attorney interview him completely alone, without me in the room. Harrison nodded, confirming that was exactly how they planned to handle it. Harlan leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long sigh. He told me to review every single page with a magnifying glass, because someone in his family had already shoved papers in his face to sign, and that person did not want him reading the fine print. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the conference room. I stared at him, trying to fathom what he must have endured during his hospital stay, to reach a point where he stripped all trust from his own flesh and blood. Harrison closed the folder and prompted Harlan to tell me about the power of attorney, so I could fully grasp why this was happening. My father-in-law nodded slowly. He explained that 6 days ago Garrison came to the hospital. He brought a thick stack of legal documents and told Harlan to sign them so he could collect the warehouse rents and hire roofers for the shop on his behalf. I asked if Garrison swore it was only for maintenance and rent. Harlan said yes. Garrison had argued that because Harlan was hospitalized, the commercial tenants might get restless and they would lose credibility if they waited too long. Harlan explained that they had just taken him off his IV drip that afternoon, and he was exhausted. Garrison tossed the papers on the rolling tray, flipped straight to the signature page, and shoved a pen at him, telling him to just sign it because he had already read through it. But Harlan did not sign it. He had spent decades running a custom woodworking business. He always read the fine print on supplier contracts. Noticing the document was unusually thick for a simple rent collection proxy, he held on to it and said he would have someone look it over first. Garrison threw a fit. He accused his father of not trusting him. Harlan replied that trusting someone and signing a blank check are two different things, and that one misplaced legal clause could ruin a man. That very evening, Harrison went to the hospital. Upon reviewing it, Harrison discovered the document was not a limited proxy for rent. It was a durable, sweeping power of attorney. It granted Garrison full authority to represent Harlan at all banking institutions, take out massive commercial loans, pledge or mortgage assets, receive funds from real estate transactions, and execute binding sales contracts in Harlan's name. My blood ran cold. That was not about fixing a roof, Harrison chimed in, confirming it was an incredibly broad preventative POA. He had advised Harlan that if he truly needed someone to handle the commercial leases, he should grant a special, limited proxy capped at 3 months, explicitly barring any power to sell or mortgage property. Harlan smiled bitterly. He told me that when he relayed that to Garrison snatched the paperwork away and screamed that old age was making him a paranoid lunatic. I asked Harlan what he said back. He said he told Garrison that being the firstborn son did not mean his father had to blindly sign his own financial death warrant. Garrison shoved his chair back in a rage and stormed out. From that day on, Garrison only showed up at the hospital one more time. He spent almost the entire visit pacing the hallway on his cell phone and spent less than 10 minutes actually in the room. He did not ask if his dad's chest still hurt. He only cornered the attending doctor to ask exactly when Harlan would be discharged and when he would be lucid enough to handle legal paperwork. Kinsley had overheard the whole thing and thought it was incredibly suspicious. Harrison noted that he had officially documented the date and time of Garrison's visit and kept a photocopy of the fraudulent POA before Garrison took the original away. I asked about Bridget. Harlan poured himself a glass of water. He said Bridget never attacks head-on. One day she would casually ask if the property deeds were kept at the house or in a bank vault. Another day, she would mention a spike in local burglaries and suggest giving the documents to Garrison for safekeeping. One afternoon, she even called Vernon to pry and ask if Harlan had ordered him to empty the safe. Vernon nodded, confirming she had poked around a couple of times. He had told her that her father's business was her father's business alone. I pointed out that Bridget did not just want the farmland. I noted she always carried a chip on her shoulder, feeling she was treated differently because she was a woman. But I brought up the fact that her husband, Kendrick, had sunk $60,000 into Garrison's supply depot. That money had no collateral, and the depot was practically insolvent. My father-in-law raised an eyebrow, asking how I knew about the money. I explained that Kendrick was always fishing for information, asking Vaughn if Garrison was going to inherit the warehouses permanently. Vaughn had flipped the question back on him, and Kendrick eventually spilled the beans. Harrison added some context. He explained that Kendrick was not directly demanding they sell the farmland, but he was banking on the fact that if Garrison managed to mortgage the family estate, the supply depot would suddenly have the liquidity to pay Kendrick back. Greed rarely knocks on the front door showing its true face. It usually dresses up as concern, responsibility, or the sacred bond of family. I looked at Harlan and asked about Vaughn. I asked how much my husband actually knew. Harlan set his glass down. He said he knew Garrison wanted to mortgage the land for financing. Harlan had confronted Vaughn about it, and Vaughn had given a diplomatic answer, saying that since Garrison was the oldest and lived nearby, it was normal for him to manage things. Harlan noted Vaughn was always playing the diplomat to avoid looking like the bad guy, but his silence allowed everyone else to step on landmines. I asked if Harlan had pressed Vaughn on exactly how far Garrison intended to take this management. Harlan said he did, and Vaughn had simply replied that brothers should not nickel and dime each other. Vaughn was terrified of being labeled selfish. My father-in-law shook his head. He said, "You cannot measure affection, but if a family's financial boundaries are blurred, everybody ends up crying in the end." That specific phrase pulled me back to a memory from 7 years ago. I had suffered a miscarriage during my first trimester. At a large family barbecue, one of Vaughn's aunts made a passive-aggressive comment. She said the city girls from Cleveland were very pretty but very fragile, and the family would just have to wait a little longer for a male heir. I had just stared down at my plate, trying to swallow my tears. Vaughn, sitting right next to me, looked incredibly uncomfortable, but he did not utter a single word in my defense. It was Harlan who slammed his wine glass down on the patio table. He announced loudly that his daughter-in-law was absolutely perfect. He told everyone that if they did not have something kind to say, they needed to shut their mouths. He declared that whether it was a boy or a girl, it would be his grandchild, and Alana's grief was not fodder for backyard gossip. The entire yard went dead silent. From that day forward, I never forgot how he stood up for me when my own husband lacked the courage to do it. Years later, he asked me to look over the warehouse ledgers. I built a massive spreadsheet breaking down every month, every tenant, the utility bills, roof repairs, and outstanding debts. One month, the accounts were off by $5. I called him immediately. He laughed, asking if I was really calling him over a $5 bill. I told him $5 today turns into $50 tomorrow, and with his money, the books had to be immaculate. The next month, he wired me an extra $100, claiming it was for my trouble. I wired it right back. I told him I helped because I was good with numbers, but if I took a cut, people would accuse me of holding the keys to the safe just to line my own pockets. I had no idea he remembered those tiny details. He looked at me and repeated his earlier statement. He said he did not choose me because I was quiet. He chose me because I was the only one who asked what he wanted before asking for the paperwork. I looked down. That statement did not bring me any joy. It only highlighted the massive, unbridgeable trench separating this father from his biological children. Harlan let out a heavy sigh. He admitted he was also to blame. He treated Garrison like the crown prince meant to inherit an empire. He told Bridget that when she married, her primary loyalty belonged to her husband's household. And he thought Vaughn was a peacemaker, when in reality, he was just a coward. He confessed he had judged people more by their family hierarchy than by their actual actions. I told him if he recognized that now, there was still time to fix it. He agreed, but clarified that fixing it did not mean paving over their mistakes with his real estate. I was still hesitating. I told him if I accepted this, the family would shatter beyond repair. Harrison, the attorney, interjected. He told me a family does not stay united by giving endless chances to people acting in bad faith. But he noted that stepping up to take control only works if the other party knows when to stop. Vernon nodded in agreement. He said a man with clean hands has nothing to fear, but even the man walking the path of truth has to dodge a few knives. I let out a bitter laugh. At that exact moment, the conference room door opened, and a woman in her 40s with her hair pulled back into a tight bun walked in. She introduced herself as Meredith, the senior closing attorney and independent arbitrator. She looked directly at my father-in-law. She announced that before reading a single deed, she needed to speak with Harlan entirely alone. She asked the family members, his personal attorney, and Mr. Vernon to please step outside. I stood up instantly. Harlan pushed himself up from the armrests and followed her at a slow pace. Before the heavy oak door clicked shut, he turned back to look at me. His eyes were incredibly serene. I was left standing there with the 4 sealed envelopes, understanding for the very first time that from this second forward, no one could make this decision for him, not even me. The heavy oak door slammed shut in my face. Out in the reception area, it was just Harrison, Vernon, and me, sitting around a sleek glass table. Through the frosted glass panels, I could only make out the blurred silhouette of my father-in-law sitting with his back perfectly straight. I checked my watch. It was barely past 1 in the afternoon, but I felt like I had aged a full year. Vernon poured me a cup of water from the cooler. He told me to relax, noting that Meredith was a bulldog. He assured me that if she sensed even a hint of coercion or confusion, she would kill the transfer on the spot. I nodded, but my hands remained tightly clasped in my lap. Meredith did not let anyone stay in the room, not even Harrison. She started the capacity evaluation with basic, grounding questions. I could hear muffled voices through the door. She asked him to state the exact date. Harlan answered clearly. She asked what medical condition he had just been treated for. He replied he had angina and hypertension, adding that his cardiologist told him to take his pills on a strict schedule and return for a follow-up in 2 weeks. She asked how many children he had. He listed Garrison as the oldest, Bridget in the middle, and Vaughn as the youngest. Meredith did not ask questions in a predictable line. She would pivot to asking about the property lines of the main house, then suddenly ask for the name of the hospital he stayed in, his late wife's maiden name, or the exact dollar amounts he had already gifted to his children. My father-in-law did not rush his answers to prove how sharp he was. On some questions, he paused to think for several seconds before speaking. That deliberate pacing made him sound entirely natural, rather than someone reciting a rehearsed script. About 20 minutes in, Meredith requested a blood pressure monitor be brought into the room. I moved to stand up, but she held up a hand through the cracked door, telling me to stay put because they were not done. Shortly after, she called Harrison in briefly to hand over the hospital discharge papers and the prescription lists. I remained banished in the waiting area. Vernon gave me a crooked smile. He reminded me I was the one who demanded they do this by the book. And now I was a nervous wreck. I admitted it, but said it broke my heart knowing he just walked out of a hospital ward only to be subjected to an interrogation. Vernon replied that if I felt bad, that was all the more reason to do it strictly by the law. That way, nobody could ever drag him to court later and claim he signed his life away while senile. Nearly 40 minutes later, Meredith ushered me into an adjacent office. Harlan remained in the main room. She placed the draft of the irrevocable trust and deed transfers on the desk. She asked if Harlan had clearly explained that this was a transfer of his exclusive, separate property. I said yes. She asked if I understood that as the grantee, these assets would belong exclusively to me and would not be considered marital property subject to division with my husband. I confirmed I understood. She looked me dead in the eye and asked if anyone had coerced me to act as a proxy, or if there was a secret handshake agreement to receive these assets only to filter them back to third parties later. She specifically asked if I had promised to redistribute them to my husband or my in-laws. I firmly stated I had promised nothing to anyone. She stared at me with severe professionalism and moved to the next phase. She emphasized that the most crucial elements were the rights and obligations. She stated Harlan was not handing me a blank check to do whatever I pleased. She began reading the restrictive covenants. Harlan retained a life estate interest in the residential property. He would continue to manage the daily operations of the cabinetry shop, use the back orchard, collect all rental income from the warehouses, and authorize routine maintenance. I was legally barred from selling, mortgaging, transferring, or altering the zoning use of any of the properties without his express notarized consent. I raised a question. I asked what would happen down the line if Harlan grew too elderly to manage the commercial tenants directly. Harrison stepped in, explaining that if that day came, a highly specific, limited power of attorney would be drafted for those exact duties. He emphasized it was terrible legal practice to establish a vague, sweeping POA right now. I pointed to the clause regarding the warehouse rents. I demanded they explicitly state that all rental income must be deposited directly into a bank account solely in Harlan's name. I clarified I would audit the books quarterly, but I absolutely refused to have signature access to his liquid cash. Meredith looked at Harrison and agreed that was a highly prudent safeguard. She ordered Harrison to type up a tighter amendment for that section. The sound of rapid typing echoed in the office. I added another condition regarding major capital expenditures. I asked what would happen if a warehouse roof collapsed and he wanted it replaced, but the LLC's account lacked the funds. I stated I was willing to inject my own capital, but it had to be legally categorized as a voluntary capital contribution or a structured, reimbursable loan. I explained I refused to be trapped by an ambiguous clause that would allow his family to accuse me of living like a queen off his rental income while he had to beg me to fix his own buildings. Meredith reminded me I still had time to back out. She warned me that just because he paid a lawyer to draft the paperwork did not mean I had to bow to the pressure. I looked through the glass. Harlan was still sitting alone, his hands resting quietly on his knees. I told them I needed to speak to my father-in-law one last time before signing. When I walked in, he asked if the attorney was giving me a hard time. I told him she was just protecting him. I sat directly across from him. I told him to listen to me very carefully one last time. I asked if he was absolutely sure. He said he was. I asked if he understood that once the county recorder stamped these documents, all 4 properties would be solely in my name. He said he understood. I asked if he was not terrified that I might wake up one day and show my true colors. He looked at me with an overwhelming sense of calm. He said of course he was. He asked who could ever guarantee the purity of another human being's heart. He explained that was exactly why the deed restrictions protected his legal rights. He told me this contract was not built purely on affection. I pointed out that he did not trust me completely. He replied that trusting someone does not mean walking blindly off a cliff. He noted he was not forcing me to swear fake loyalty to him, so he was not forcing himself to rely solely on empty promises. That raw, pragmatic honesty gave me more peace of mind than any tearful vow ever could. He put on his reading glasses and ordered me to get to work. He told me to read every single page, and if something looked shady, to make them change it. He said it was better to waste an hour now than to regret it for the rest of our lives. During a brief recess, Vernon's wife, Loretta, showed up with takeout food and a pill organizer. She used to be a medical assistant, so she made sure Harlan took his prescribed doses exactly on time. She checked his blood pressure again and gave the green light to proceed. I offered to feed him the soup myself, but he swatted my hand away, insisting he could feed himself and telling me to focus on the fine print. I joked that if he spilled beef stew all over the trust documents, his $1.5 million estate was going to smell like celery and carrots. He laughed out loud, saying at least his legacy would have some flavor. The tension in the room finally broke. Early in the afternoon, they printed the final copies of the 4 deeds. The first was the main house and orchard. The second was the cabinetry shop. The third was the 6 industrial warehouses. The fourth was the adjacent commercial lot. They were read aloud. Harlan signed every single page in front of Meredith. Then I signed. Nobody signed on behalf of anyone else. Nobody had to point to where he needed to scribble his name. When we reached the final envelope, Vernon broke the seal to pull out the original property deed for the commercial lot near the industrial park. He frowned, flipped the heavy parchment over, and flipped it again. He muttered that it was weird. Harrison asked what was wrong. Vernon held up a certified photocopy, but the thick folder pocket where the original embossed title should have been was completely empty. Harrison demanded to know where the original document was. I looked at my father-in-law. He slowly took off his reading glasses and asked Vernon exactly what day he had emptied the safe. Vernon swore he opened the exact lockbox the day before Harlan was admitted to the hospital. He said the other 4 files were complete, but this one only had a photocopy inside. Vernon assumed Harlan had given it to Harrison for prep work. Harrison shook his head adamantly, stating he had never possessed the original. Meredith slammed her legal binder shut. She declared that if the original title was missing and they could not verify the chain of custody or check for unrecorded liens in real time, she was halting this specific transfer. She stated she would not authorize a real estate donation based on a photocopy. I asked if we could just request a duplicate title from the county recorder's office and run a fresh title search. Harrison agreed they could, but warned that they first needed to know where the original was. He said if someone was currently using the physical deed as collateral in a backroom transaction, they were in massive legal jeopardy. Harlan's face changed completely. He closed his eyes, digging through his memory. He asked who had kept his house keys the day he was rushed to the ER. Vernon answered quietly. Garrison. Garrison had gone into the house to grab clothes and his Medicare card. I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. Harlan asked to review the serial numbers of all the documents and the notary log from the day the safe was opened. There was no mistake. Harlan grabbed his smartphone, opened the family group text, and typed clumsily. He demanded everyone meet at Vernon's house at 6 p.m. because he had a serious matter to settle. The second he hit send, Harrison's cell phone started ringing. He answered it, and all the blood drained from his face. He asked the caller to identify himself. The man on the other end was speaking frantically. Harrison looked at Harlan and asked if he was seriously telling him that the large commercial parcel next to the industrial park had already been sold to a man named Clayton. The conference room felt like a tomb. Harlan gripped the armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles turned white. He stated with absolute fury that he had never sold that land to anyone. Loretta drove Harlan to Vernon's house, settling him into a recliner in the living room. She took his blood pressure again and placed a bowl of hot soup in front of him. I strategically arranged his pill bottles, the hospital discharge papers, and the doctor's orders right in the center of the coffee table. I wanted it abundantly clear to everyone walking into that room that I was not hiding his medical condition or taking advantage of a delirious old man to force a backdoor inheritance. Harlan had barely swallowed 2 spoonfuls when the crunch of tires sounded on the gravel driveway. Garrison barged in first, followed by his wife, Lorraine. Garrison took massive, aggressive strides and did not even bother asking how his father was feeling. The first words out of his mouth were a demand to know what assets his dad had been transferring into my name. The temperature in the room plummeted. Harlan dropped his spoon into the bowl. He asked Garrison if he made it a habit to storm into another man's house without greeting the host. Garrison halted, gave Vernon a stiff, obligatory nod, and threw himself heavily onto the sofa. He groaned that this was not a minor issue. Lorraine discreetly tugged at his sleeve, whispering for him to slow down because his father was fresh out of the hospital. Garrison yanked his arm away, snapping that she did not understand what was at stake. Shortly after, Bridget and her husband, Kendrick, walked in. Bridget crossed the threshold with red, puffy eyes and went straight on the offensive. She accused her father of operating behind their backs, claiming it proved he preferred his daughter-in-law over his own flesh and blood. Kendrick set a bag of groceries on the table and spoke in a calm, yet entirely venomous tone. He told Harlan that regardless of how he chose to divide the family legacy, he should at least consult the bloodline. He warned that letting an outsider walk away with the deeds would make him the laughingstock of the county. Hearing him call me an outsider made my blood boil. Harlan turned to Kendrick with agonizing slowness. He repeated the word outsider back to him. Kendrick, suddenly intimidated, stammered that he was just talking about the natural order of things. Harlan asked what natural order granted a son-in-law sitting on someone else's couch the authority to dictate who was and was not family. Kendrick shut his mouth. At 6:30, Vaughn arrived. His dress shirt was wrinkled, and his hair was damp from the Ohio rain. He looked at me first, then at his father. He asked how he was feeling. Harlan replied dryly that he was still breathing. Vaughn pressed his lips together, dragged a dining chair over, and sat right next to me. He asked me if I had really signed the papers. I turned to face him. I asked if he drove all this way to check on his father's heart or his father's real estate. Vaughn lowered his voice, claiming he was just trying to solve this peacefully. Garrison slammed his hand onto the coffee table. He mocked the idea of peace. He yelled that their dad had just been discharged and I had dragged him to a lawyer's office, claiming the manipulation was crystal clear. I picked up my phone and set it on the table. I told them to get everything out in the open, in chronological order. I opened my call log from that morning. I looked at Garrison and stated that at 8:42 a.m., the nurse called him, but he claimed he was waiting on a massive freight delivery. Garrison crossed his arms defensively, insisting a semi-truck from Chicago was bringing thousands of dollars in drywall and lumber, and his contractors could not wait. I told him that at 8:50 a.m., his depot manager had already signed the delivery manifest. I said I called the depot personally to verify it. Garrison's eyes went wide. He accused me of spying on him. I replied I was just trying to figure out why, by noon, he still had not picked up his father. I turned my sights on Bridget. I noted that at 7 to 10 a.m., she claimed her kid was running a fever. Bridget jumped defensively, swearing it was the truth. I pulled up the screenshot of her Instagram post at the perfumery. I asked her who the woman in the photo at 10 to 10 a.m. was. Bridget's face flushed crimson. She stammered that she only popped in for 5 minutes and left Kellen with Kendrick. I told her I was not judging her for going to a grand opening, but I was judging her for using her sick child as a human shield to avoid picking up her dad. Bridget choked on her excuses. I finally looked at my husband. I reminded him he was the one who suggested the hospital call an Uber. Vaughn let out a heavy sigh, repeating that he was working, and had already explained that to me. I shot back that I was working too, and my kids needed to be picked up from school, but someone had to physically go get his father. Garrison let out a mocking laugh. He gave a sarcastic speech about how noble I was, sneering that if I had not secretly known Dad was signing over the estate today, I would not have been so eager to play the hero. I stared a hole right through him. I told him I did not have the slightest clue about the estate until his father sat in my passenger seat and handed me the lawyer's address. Garrison demanded proof. I offered my call logs, my swipe card exit time from my Cleveland office, and the hospital parking garage security footage. Harlan suddenly pushed himself up from his recliner. He yelled for them to shut up, stating he did not call them here to see who could argue the loudest. He signaled to Harrison. The attorney pulled out the photocopy of the fraudulent power of attorney that Garrison had brought to the hospital. Harlan slid the paper across the table toward his eldest son. He reminded Garrison that he claimed this was just a proxy to collect warehouse rent. Garrison glanced at it and nodded stubbornly. Harrison pointed to the specific paragraphs. He read aloud the clauses granting full representative power to solicit commercial loans, pledge collateral, execute real estate sales, and liquidate the grantor's assets. Garrison waved it off, claiming it was just a generic template he downloaded off LegalZoom. Harlan fired back, asking why he did not edit it if all he wanted was to collect rent. Garrison complained he was a busy man with no time to read every single line. Harlan stared him down and asked if the real reason he did not edit it was because a rent-only proxy would not let him use the family land to save his bankrupt business. Garrison leaped to his feet. He begged his dad not to listen to the gossip of strangers and stop distrusting his own son. Harlan slammed his hand down so hard the soup bowl rattled. He demanded to know who the stranger was. He pointed out that when a licensed attorney reads a contract, he is a stranger, but when a son shoves a blank check in his sick father's face and demands a signature, he is the pinnacle of family virtue. Lorraine tugged at Garrison's belt, begging him to sit down and calm down. Garrison screamed at her to shut up. Lorraine turned ghost white. Harlan surveyed the room and dropped the ultimate question. He asked where the original deed for the commercial lot was. Nobody answered. He locked eyes with Garrison. He reminded him that on the day of the heart scare, Garrison had his house keys. Garrison smiled sarcastically. He asked if having keys automatically made him a thief. He pointed out that Vernon knew exactly where the safe was and suggested anyone could have hidden the deed to frame him. Vernon slammed his water glass onto the table. He told Garrison he had been his father's best friend for 40 years, and he better have hard evidence before throwing accusations around. Garrison pivoted to me. He suggested maybe Alana took it and was playing dumb so he would take the fall. Vaughn finally raised his voice. He told Garrison he was crossing a line. Garrison snapped at him to shut his mouth, taunting Vaughn that his wife just hijacked an empire and he was still acting like her lapdog. Vaughn turned to me, his jaw tight with tension. He begged me to just sign a temporary waiver. He pleaded with me to step aside so he, his siblings, and his dad could handle it behind closed doors, promising it would be easier if I stayed out of it. I stared at my husband for a long time. I asked if he had even read the trust agreement. He said no. I asked if he had bothered to ask his dad why he drafted it. He said no. I pointed out that despite knowing nothing, he wanted me to surrender my legal standing, just so his family would stop yelling. Vaughn looked at the floor, muttering that he just wanted to save the family. I let out a bitter laugh. I asked if his definition of saving the family meant forcing the only innocent person to step back, while the guy who stole the deeds did not have to explain a damn thing. Right then, tires crunched violently in the driveway. A heavy-set man in his 50s wearing a black Carhartt jacket barged through the front door. Vernon recognized him instantly. It was Clayton. Vernon asked what he was doing there. The man threw a manila folder onto the coffee table. Contracts and 2 bank wire receipts spilled out. Clayton demanded answers. He yelled that he had wired Garrison $140,000 in earnest money for the commercial lot. The entire room went dead silent. Garrison jumped up like he had been electrocuted. He panicked, telling Clayton they would talk about this tomorrow. Clayton whipped around, shouting that there was no tomorrow. He explained that a closing attorney had just called him asking if the land was under contract, and now Harlan was claiming he never sold it. Clayton demanded to know what was happening to his money. He flipped the contract open and pointed to the bottom of the last page. He pointed at Harlan's signature. He explained, Garrison told him Harlan was hospitalized, and, as the eldest son in proxy, he was handling the deposit. Clayton had wired the funds in 2 batches, $80,000 and $60,000. Harlan picked up the contract. He stared at it for a long time, then slowly took off his glasses. He admitted it was an almost perfect forgery. Garrison immediately jumped in. He pleaded with his dad, claiming they had already agreed to this deal verbally, and begged him not to back out now just because Alana had brainwashed him. Harlan looked up. His voice was not booming, but it was as hard as granite. He stated unequivocally that he had never signed that piece of paper. Clayton turned pale. He swore that was impossible. He claimed he had a voice recording. He pulled out his phone and played an audio clip. Garrison's voice came through loud and clear. Garrison was heard saying his dad was fully on board and just needed to be discharged to ratify the paperwork before a notary. The recording ended with Garrison pressuring Clayton to wire the earnest money quickly because prime real estate like that would get snatched up in a heartbeat. I looked at Garrison. For the first time since he swaggered into the house, the arrogance was wiped clean off his face. Clayton killed the audio and dropped his phone on the table. Outside, the rain continued to batter the windows. Garrison was the first to break the silence. He begged Clayton not to just listen to one side of the story. He claimed his dad was getting old and confused, agreeing to things one day and forgetting them the next. He swore his dad had authorized the sale before the hospital trip. Harlan shot him a death glare. He reminded Garrison that when they briefly discussed it, Garrison had complained the land was sitting unused, and Harlan had merely said if a good offer came along, they would think about it. Harlan roared that saying, "We'll think about it," does not authorize you to forge a signature and pocket 6 figures in cash. Clayton frowned in confusion. He told Harlan that Garrison had sworn they needed emergency cash for medical bills and warehouse renovations. Clayton revealed that while the market value was over $400,000, Garrison offered it at a steep discount in exchange for rapid, liquid cash. I asked how steep of a discount. Clayton admitted it was about 15% below market rate, noting Garrison claimed he needed the cash flow for his supply depot. Garrison snapped at Clayton, telling him that was a private business dealing between the two of them. Harlan fired back instantly, screaming that his farmland was not a private dealing between them. Clayton pulled a color-printed document from his briefcase. He said it was a copy of the original deed. He noted Garrison had brought it to their initial meeting. I looked at the page. The parcel ID, the acreage, and the title holder's name were completely accurate. Harrison asked Clayton where exactly he saw the original document. Clayton replied, he saw it inside Garrison's truck. He explained Garrison pulled it out of an envelope to prove he had it, but refused to let Clayton make a photocopy, claiming it was not safe to leave his dad's original documents floating around a real estate office. I turned to Garrison and asked again where the deed was. He shrugged defensively. He mumbled that he must have accidentally grabbed it when he was packing up his dad's stuff, but he couldn't remember where he put it. Harlan let out a harsh, dry laugh. He pointed out that 5 minutes ago, Garrison swore on his life he had never touched the safe. Now, he suddenly remembered packing up legal documents by accident. Harlan asked if showing the deed to a prospective buyer was an accident too. Garrison scowled. Clayton chimed in again, noting Garrison had also shown him a scanned PDF of Harlan's driver's license, which made the whole thing look completely legitimate. Harrison asked a very pointed question. He asked who emailed the scanned deed and the ID to Garrison in the first place. I saw Vaughn clench his fists under the table. Harlan looked directly at his youngest son. He asked Vaughn if he knew where those digital files came from. Vaughn swallowed so loudly I could hear it. He confessed that last year, when they had to update tax records for the LLC, Harlan had asked him to scan the ID and deeds to keep digital backups on a hard drive. Harlan asked what happened after that. Vaughn admitted that 3 months ago, Garrison asked him to email over the PDF of the commercial lot and a copy of the ID. Harlan asked why. Vaughn said Garrison claimed he needed them for a bank to run a preliminary feasibility study to secure a business expansion loan. I looked at my husband in absolute disbelief. I asked him if he knew his father had not given permission for a mortgage, yet he sent the files anyway. Vaughn got defensive. He insisted it was just for a feasibility study, arguing it was just a digital file, not the physical deed. Garrison lunged at him verbally, telling him not to play the saint because he knew exactly what was going on. He accused Vaughn of being the one who suggested the unused land should be leveraged. Vaughn yelled back that he only said they could explore options times if Time's dad agreed, and he never told Garrison to forge a signature. Garrison sneered that without Vaughn emailing the files, he never could have drafted the earnest money contract in the first place. Harlan closed his eyes. His face no longer showed rage, just an unfathomable exhaustion. I grilled Vaughn. I asked if he checked with his dad before hitting send. He said no. I asked if he verified which bank Garrison was using. He said no. I asked if he ever requested to see the supposed feasibility study. He said no. Vaughn tried to justify himself, admitting he was negligent, but swearing he had no idea Garrison was going to use the files to commit fraud. I spoke to him slowly and clearly. I told him he might not have known about the forgery, but he knew damn well his brother intended to use their father's assets as collateral. I told him he purposefully chose not to ask follow-up questions, because if he did, he would have been forced to tell his brother no. Garrison let out a bark of laughter. He mocked my speech, pointing out that now that the empire was in my name, suddenly everyone else was a criminal. I didn't even look at Garrison. I kept my eyes locked on my husband. Vaughn grabbed my arm and begged me to step outside to talk. I followed him onto the covered patio. The freezing wind whipped our faces. Vaughn stood under the awning, rubbing his hands together nervously. He begged me to listen. He warned that if this blew up, Garrison wouldn't just go to jail. He said his dad would have to go to court, sit through interrogations, and the whole town would gossip about them. I asked what his brilliant solution was. He told me to sign the waiver. He proposed they sell a chunk of another property, pay Clayton back, make Garrison fix the rest, and wash their dirty laundry in private. I stared at him for a long time. I asked if he seriously wanted his father to liquidate his own land to pay off a scam his brother orchestrated, just to avoid a scandal. I asked who that was actually better for. Vaughn claimed it was better for the whole family. I summarized his plan. His father's wealth evaporates. I look like a gold digger who got forced out, and Garrison walks away completely unpunished. I asked if that was his definition of family. Vaughn lowered his voice, begging me not to back him into a corner. I smiled sadly. I told him he already picked his corner the day he emailed the files without asking his dad. Vaughn stayed quiet. I asked him if he actually wanted to protect his father, or if he just wanted to keep his brother's felony out of the local paper. He admitted he wanted to protect the family's reputation. I told him a family's honor is not preserved by covering up fraud, it is preserved by stopping it. Vaughn glanced back inside the house and pleaded with me, arguing that if the sheriff got involved, our kids would grow up with a stigma, and people in Cleveland would find out. I told him not to use our children as a human shield for his own cowardice. He flinched. I enunciated every word with crystal clarity. I told him I was taking the kids to my parents' house for the foreseeable future. I said he could see them whenever he wanted, but I would not allow him to manipulate the narrative and tell them I was the one who broke the family. He asked if I was really leaving him over something Garrison did. I told him I was not leaving because of Garrison. I was leaving because he knew his father's livelihood was in danger, handed his brother the weapons, and when it all blew up, he demanded his wife's silence and his father's land to buy himself some peace and quiet. Vaughn took a step toward me, insisting he was just careless and that I was exaggerating the situation. That phrase froze the blood in my veins. It was the exact same thing he told me that morning when his father was abandoned in the hospital lobby. I took a step back. I realized that anything that required him to confront his family was just an exaggeration to him. Harlan was standing in the doorway. God knows how long he had been standing there. He probably heard the whole thing. He leaned heavily against the wooden doorframe, his voice cracking. He told me I didn't have to leave my home because of him. I turned to him. I told him I was not leaving because of him. I just could not go back and pretend everything was normal. Vaughn looked at his dad, begging him to talk sense into me. He promised that if Harlan canceled the deeds, they could all sit down as a family and figure it out. Harlan looked at his youngest son with absolute finality. He told Vaughn that a pile of notarized papers didn't destroy this family. He said the way they treated each other had destroyed it a long time ago. Inside the living room, Clayton was screaming at Garrison to sign a legally binding promissory note to refund the money immediately. Garrison refused, arguing the family needed to reach a consensus first. The screaming match dragged on until nearly 10 at night with no resolution. I drove back to Cleveland that same night. Harlan wanted me to sleep in the guest room, but I needed to pack up my kids and get out of my house before Vaughn got back. The next morning, I moved Declan and Sloan into my parents' house indefinitely. I told them Mom and Dad needed some space to figure out some adult issues, and that it had nothing to do with them. Declan asked if Dad was still coming over for dinner. I hugged him tight and told him Dad would always be his dad. My phone buzzed. It was Harrison, the attorney. He texted me that Clayton had officially hired a litigator and was drafting a civil suit for breach of contract over the earnest money. But there was a much bigger problem. He said someone had just posted a video to the local community Facebook pages showing Harlan completely disoriented in his hospital bed. I clicked the link he sent. Beneath the grainy footage, a caption in all caps read, "Cleveland daughter, in, law scam Senel old man out of $1.5 million estate." Watching my father-in-law's hollow, exhausted face on my screen, I realized the war had spilled out of Vernon's living room and was now actively trying to butcher my reputation. I did not reply to a single text that night. I just sat at my laptop, taking screenshots of every comment, every insult, and every profile that shared the video. Some called me a snake. Others claimed that because I was an executive accountant, I knew exactly how to cook the books and hide the assets. Distant relatives even called my mother, asking if it was true that I had just struck gold by manipulating a dementia patient. My mother hung up the phone, sat down across from me, and asked if I had done anything illegal or immoral. I said no. She told me to dry my eyes because I was not allowed to cry in front of people who wanted to see me drown. I didn't cry, but I barely slept a wink. The next morning I walked into my corporate office right on time. I sat at my desk like any other Tuesday. But the stares were different. Two analysts chatting by the copier went dead silent the second I walked past. By noon, the director of human resources called me into her office. She told me she knew this was a personal family dispute, but she was worried the inheritance drama was going to impact my performance. I maintained a strictly professional tone, assuring her I was executing my duties as usual. She admitted someone had forwarded anonymous links to the corporate email server, accusing me of elder abuse and financial fraud. I kept my voice ice cold. I told her the narrative online was completely fabricated. I explained the entire legal transfer was executed with strict adherence to state law, overseen by a senior closing attorney who conducted a rigorous, independent capacity evaluation. I offered to have my legal counsel provide the firm with a formal briefing if necessary. The HR director sighed uncomfortably, clarifying she was not judging me, but just needed to ensure the company's name was not dragged into a scandal. I nodded and walked out of her office, feeling another massive boulder stacked onto my shoulders. That afternoon, Harrison called to confirm Clayton had officially filed a civil lawsuit demanding specific performance on the earnest money contract. He was demanding the court force the sale of the lot, or alternatively, refund the $140,000 plus punitive damages for breach of contract. I asked if the judge accepting the filing meant the contract was deemed valid. Harrison said no, it just meant the discovery phase would begin. They would have to subpoena handwriting experts, run title searches, depose Harlan, and gather evidence. He clarified that the other 4 properties transferred into my name were completely separate deeds. Only the disputed commercial lot would get slapped with a times list pendens times a notice of pending litigation to freeze any further transactions, but they could not automatically lock down the rest of my properties over one allegedly forged private contract. I breathed a sigh of relief. However, Harrison admitted the Facebook video was his biggest concern. Garrison and his camp were weaponizing it to argue Harlan lacked the legal capacity to consent on the day of the signing. I pulled the video up again. Harlan was in his hospital gown. His hair was a mess and his eyes were unfocused. A voice off-camera asked him what day it was. He blinked and gave a date from a decade ago. Then he called for Kinsley the nurse, but used his late wife's name. At the end of the clip, he mumbled, asking if she had made dinner yet. My mother-in-law had been dead for 8 years. If I were an outsider watching that 60-second clip, I would probably think I was a predator too. I asked Harrison if it was a deepfake. He said no, it was highly likely genuine footage, just maliciously stripped of context. I felt the ground open up beneath me. The most lethal lies are the ones mixed with a drop of truth. I wanted to log on immediately and post the medical discharge summary, the photos with the closing attorney, and my own text receipts to prove my innocence. Harrison stopped me. He told me never to wrestle in the mud on social media. He ordered me to just document the URLs, timestamps, and defamatory comments. He said we needed to get our hands on the raw, unedited video file and subpoena the hospital's medication administration records for that specific day. He reminded me that silence is not an admission of guilt, and the more unhinged I acted online, the more ammunition I handed them. That night, Vaughn showed up at my parents' house. He sat in his parked car for 30 minutes before working up the nerve to call me. I walked out to the driveway to speak with him, but I did not invite him inside. The kids were at the kitchen table doing homework. Vaughn looked haggard and hollowed out. He asked if I saw Clayton's lawsuit. I said yes. He begged me to just sign the properties back. He promised that if I did, things would go back to normal. I stared at him, genuinely amazed that after everything, he was still clinging to his cowardly escape hatch. I asked him if he was there to apologize or to beg me to surrender. He said he just wanted to save the family. I asked him which family. His dad? His siblings? His entire clan? He nodded. I delivered my response with surgical precision. I reminded him Garrison used his father's stolen ID to commit a 6-figure felony. Bridget fed a video of their father at his most vulnerable to a digital mob to destroy my career. And Vaughn wanted me to voluntarily surrender the legal rights his father freely granted me, just so none of them had to face a judge. I told him that in his twisted worldview, I was always the collateral damage. Vaughn muttered that just because I was sitting on $1.5 million in real estate, I thought I was untouchable. That sentence felt like a slap to the face. I told him to get off my parents' property. He stammered, claiming he didn't mean it like that. He took a step forward, but I backed away. I told him that if he ever figured out where his spine was, he could call me. I said if his only goal was to make his wife take the bullet so his brother wouldn't get indicted, we had nothing left to discuss. I turned around and walked back inside. Vaughn didn't chase after me. Later that night, my cell phone rang. It was my father-in-law. His voice sounded weaker than usual. He told me he was going to annul the deeds. I was stunned. I asked him what he was talking about. He said he couldn't stand watching my name get dragged through the mud. He noted I had a high-profile corporate career and 2 kids to protect. He said he was an old man, and it didn't matter if he lost a few acres of dirt. I pressed the phone hard against my ear. I told him it wasn't about the acreage. I explained that if we backed down just because they weaponized a video to defame me, we were teaching them that extortion works. He asked how much longer I could withstand the pressure. I admitted I didn't know, but swore I would never let him walk into a courtroom and declare himself incompetent just to bail out his kids. A heavy silence hung on the line. He whispered an apology, saying I was suffering because of his failures. I told him never to apologize for the sins of other people. Right after I hung up, a text from an unknown number buzzed in. It read, "Cry me a river, but you still stole the old man's money." I took a screenshot, dropped it in the evidence folder, and powered off my phone. The next morning, I called Kinsley at the medical center. I asked if she remembered a specific day when someone recorded a video of Harlan acting delirious. There was a pause. She recalled an afternoon where they had administered a heavy dose of a sedative to calm his heart rate, and he woke up extremely disoriented. She noted the episode barely lasted 15 minutes before he regained total clarity. I asked if there was a digital log of the medication. She confirmed it was in his chart, but stated she could not release it without a court subpoena. I asked if she saw who was holding the camera. She said she didn't get a good look, but Bridget was the only visitor in the room that afternoon. My mind went blank. Bridget. The same woman who sat in Vernon's house crying that her father loved me more than his own daughter. Before I could even process it, Vernon called me. There was a massive amount of background noise on his end. He yelled for me to get down to Marysville immediately. He said a crew of thugs had shown up at the warehouses. They had brought heavy chains and brand new padlocks, claiming the land belonged to Clayton now. I jumped out of my office chair. I screamed at Vernon not to confront them and to call the sheriff's department right that second. Vernon yelled over the roar of diesel engines that the goons were blocking the commercial trucks from leaving the loading docks, screaming that nothing was moving in or out. I grabbed my keys, bolted out of my Cleveland office, and hit the highway. It wasn't even noon. During the 2-hour drive south, Vernon called twice more, saying the tension was boiling over. I begged him not to touch the chains or pick a physical fight. I pulled up to the site just past 3 o'clock. From a distance, I saw 3 massive semi-trucks parked nose to tail, blocking the main gate of the industrial park. The logistics drivers were huddled together, aggressively yelling into their phones and arguing with the goons. Right in the center of the chain-link gate, a heavy-duty master lock and chain barred the entrance. Behind the fence stood 6 guys with their arms crossed. Clayton was leaning against a black-lifted pickup truck, looking stressed and clutching a stack of papers. I hopped out of my SUV and marched straight up to him. I demanded to know who gave him the authority to padlock an active commercial property. Clayton spun around, pointing a finger at me. He yelled that he was just protecting his investment. He claimed he paid the earnest money and the land legally belonged to him. I glanced at the papers in his hand. I asked him if he had a court order signed by a judge authorizing him to paralyze interstate commerce and hold corporate freight hostage. Clayton scowled. He yelled that he paid $140,000, and if my family gutted the warehouses or devalued the lot, nobody would refund him. I informed him the freight belonged to the corporate tenants, not my father-in-law. I reminded him his contract was currently under investigation for felony forgery. I warned him that taking the law into his own hands constituted criminal coercion. One of the hired goons stepped forward, puffing out his chest, claiming they were just following orders. I got right in his face. I told him the order was illegal. I pointed out they were holding 3 commercial rigs hostage and asked which one of them was going to sign the check for the thousands of dollars in liability damages the logistics companies were going to sue them for. None of them answered. Vernon came jogging out of a warehouse, sweating profusely. He told me he called the sheriff's dispatch and deputies were en route. I nodded and turned to the truck drivers. I told them to stay by their cabs, photograph the license plates of the guys blocking the gate, and write down the exact minute their routes were impeded. I ordered them not to touch the chains, stressing I did not want a brawl. One of the truckers complained loudly that if his delivery was late, his company would dock his pay. I assured him the police report would reflect exactly who caused the delay so he could file a claim. Clayton let out a mocking laugh. He told me I sounded like a lawyer. He claimed Garrison warned him I would try to sneak assets out of the warehouses. I looked him dead in the eye. I asked him where Garrison was right now. Clayton hesitated. I pointed out that Garrison took his cash. Garrison swore the land was sold, and now that things were getting ugly, Garrison sent a bunch of hired muscles to do his dirty work while he hid in his office. I asked Clayton if that didn't strike him as a massive red flag. Clayton's jaw tightened, but he stubbornly stated he was protecting his money. I told him to protect it in a courtroom, not with a padlock. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 sheriff's cruisers and a local police interceptor pulled up with lights flashing. I explained the situation with total detachment. I presented the digital copies of the property deeds showing Harlan was the legal life tenant, and informed the officers there was an active criminal complaint for fraud. Clayton shoved his earnest money contract at the deputies. The lead sheriff's deputy was blunt. He told Clayton that until a civil court judge ruled on that private contract, Clayton had 0 possessory rights and 0 authority to obstruct a public roadway. He ordered the goons to cut the chains immediately. One of Clayton's guys muttered under his breath about the cops making a big deal out of nothing as he pulled out bolt cutters. Vernon pulled out his smartphone and started recording them cutting the lock. He announced he was recording it so nobody could lie later and say they didn't illegally blockade the gate. A young kid in a black hoodie got in his face, telling the old man to put the camera away. Vernon took a step back, keeping the camera pointed at the gate, pointing out that if they weren't doing anything illegal, they shouldn't care. The kid lunged and tried to snatch the phone. A scuffle broke out. A small security camera mounted on the brick pillar was knocked loose, smashing onto the concrete driveway. I ran toward them, but the kid shoved Vernon violently in the chest. Vernon lost his balance, tripped over the concrete curb, and slammed the back of his head against the exposed brick wall. Blood instantly began pooling on the concrete. I dropped to my knees, grabbed a wad of tissues from my purse, and pressed it hard against the gash. Loretta, Vernon's wife, came sprinting out of the warehouse, her face pale with terror. She screamed for Clarence, one of the shop workers, to get help. Vernon, clearly dizzy, still tried to crack a joke. He told Loretta to stop screaming because the fall didn't make him deaf. Through her tears, she lightly smacked his shoulder, crying that he was impossible for making jokes while bleeding out. I yelled for someone to call an ambulance. The deputies immediately detained everyone involved, confiscated the dropped cell phone, and retrieved the SD card from the smashed security camera. I was about to climb into the back of the ambulance, but Loretta grabbed my arm. She told me to stay at the scene, deal with the police, and make sure everything was documented. She said she would ride to the ER with him. I stared at the puddle of blood on the concrete, feeling nauseous. Clayton walked over to me. His aggressive bravado was completely gone. He swore he didn't pay those guys to assault an elderly man. I shot back that maybe he didn't give the green light for violence, but he was the one who brought a gang to extort us. I told him everyone would pay for their role, but he couldn't wash his hands of this. Clayton stared at the broken camera pieces. He offered to cover the medical bills. I told him we would discuss bills later, but what happened today was a straight-up felony assault. After the deputies took my official statement and cleared the gate, the 3 semi-trucks rolled out. The aggressors were shoved into the back of the cruisers. I stayed behind to inventory the damage to the gate and calculate the lost revenue for the logistics firms. By dusk, Clayton was still lingering in the parking lot. Leaning against his truck, he was frantically calling Garrison. Garrison was dodging his calls. Finally, Garrison called back. Clayton put him on speakerphone. Garrison sounded frantic, desperate for cash flow, and ordered Clayton to keep the gates locked and not let anyone move inventory. Clayton gritted his teeth. He screamed that his guys had just cracked an old man's skull open, the sheriff had cut the chains, and asked how the hell he was supposed to lock it down now. He demanded Garrison show up and force his dad to sign the final transfer. Garrison stammered, making excuses. Clayton reminded Garrison he swore his dad was on board and that, if he got stubborn, the 3 siblings would pressure him into it. Garrison hesitated. Clayton glared at me, then hung up the phone abruptly. That was the exact moment I saw the seed of doubt take root in Clayton's eyes. He was finally realizing he had bought a bridge to nowhere. Harrison arrived shortly after. We stood in the parking lot and scrolled through the text messages on Clayton's phone. There was one from Garrison sent a week ago. It read, Soon as he's out of the hospital, Dad signs. If he plays hardball, me and my siblings will handle him. Just wire the deposit. Clayton slumped into a plastic lawn chair. He realized that when Garrison took his cash, the deal was never secure. Harrison nodded. Confirming the texts proved Garrison knew his father didn't consent and actively defrauded Clayton to secure the $140,000. Clayton rubbed his face in despair. He admitted he had leased warehouse space from Harlan for years and trusted Garrison because he was the eldest son running the family business. I told Clayton the real reason he trusted Garrison was because the price was 15% below market value and he got blinded by a steal. Clayton looked up, but he didn't argue. Later that night, I stopped by the emergency room. Vernon had required 4 staples in his scalp, but CT scans showed no neurological damage. Loretta was sitting beside his bed, still shaking. Vernon saw me walk in and flashed a goofy grin. He told me to stop looking like I was at a funeral because it was just a scratch. Loretta glared at him, pointing out that his scratch soaked through an entire bath towel. I squeezed Vernon's hand. I begged him to stop jumping in front of trains and let the lawyers handle the legal fights. He shook his head. He said he didn't take a hit to protect a few acres of dirt. He did it to defend his best friend's honor. He told me the truth might take a beating, but it doesn't die, and a man walking a straight line doesn't bow his head to anyone. Near midnight, as I was leaving the hospital, my phone rang. It was Bridget. The second I answered, I heard her hyperventilating. She gasped that she had just read Kendrick's text messages with Garrison. I asked her what was wrong. Her voice shattered. She sobbed that Garrison never intended to pay them back first. She realized Garrison had used them as puppets to pressure their dad. I pulled my SUV onto the shoulder of the highway, hit the hazard lights, and let her cry. She confessed that Kendrick had secretly funneled $60,000 into Garrison's business, not $20,000 like he originally claimed. He had drained their joint savings account, the money they were saving to remodel their condo. I gripped the steering wheel. I asked how she found out. She admitted she picked up his old phone by mistake and read a thread from months ago. Kendrick had asked Garrison when they were going to corner their dad into selling so he could get his cash back. Garrison had texted back, "If I leverage the warehouses, suppliers get paid first. Family gets paid last." She paused, struggling to breathe. She cried that she thought her husband was trying to support her family, but all Kendrick really wanted was for her to emotionally blackmail her own father to cover a bad bet. I didn't rush to comfort her. Sometimes swallowing the bitter pill of reality is better than empty platitudes. I asked if she took screenshots. She said not yet. Kendrick was in the shower and she only had time to skim a few messages. I ordered her not to delete anything, and not to alert him. I told her to be at Harrison's law office first thing in the morning to give an official deposition. Bridget panicked. She asked if she really had to take it that far. I told her I knew she was scared, but if she read the entire chat log, she would see exactly how deep her husband's complicity ran. I told her Kendrick had to face the music. Bridget broke down again. She wailed that she only wanted her savings back. I told her I understood, but pointed out she was willing to force her dad to sell his legacy to cover an unauthorized gamble. Silence filled the car. The next morning, Bridget met me at a coffee shop near Harrison's downtown Columbus office. Her eyes were swollen shut, and Kendrick's old iPhone was sitting on the table. The second I sat down, she showed me the screenshots. The bank wires proved Kendrick emptied $60,000 from a joint account in 3 installments. In another text, Kendrick wrote, "If the old man digs his heels in, send Bridget. She's always jealous of you inheriting the business. She'll know exactly how to guilt trip him," Garrison replied. "Let her do it. Dads can't say no to their daughters." Reading that made my throat burn. They hadn't just exploited her greed. They weaponized her childhood trauma to turn her into a pawn. Bridget looked at me. She said she would give the phone to the attorney, but demanded I promise not to press charges against Kendrick over the real estate fraud. I set the phone down on the table. I said no. She stared at me in terror, asking if I wanted to destroy her marriage and send the father of her kids to trial. I told her I didn't want to destroy anything, but she couldn't cherry-pick which evidence to submit. I reminded her Kendrick was a co-conspirator and she had 2 kids to think about. She argued she was a victim of a secret financial betrayal. I told her that was complacency talking, not victimhood. I reminded her they created this mess, not the people bringing it to light. Bridget smiled sarcastically. She said that now that I owned the whole empire, it was real easy for me to preach from a moral high ground. That stung, but I didn't lose my temper. I knew that because of the sheer volume of wealth involved, I could not trade immunity for evidence. I told her she could walk away if she wanted, but if she destroyed the evidence now, she would be throwing away her only lifeline. She stood up abruptly. Her chair screeched against the floor, turning the heads of the baristas. She pulled her coat tight and stormed out without a word. I watched her go, feeling a mix of pity and absolute frustration. Bridget was so addicted to playing the victim that she couldn't even see she was an accomplice in her own father's humiliation. That afternoon she called me, sounding utterly defeated. She said Kendrick figured out she snooped through his phone. I asked what he said. She said he ordered her to delete the screenshots and throw the old phone in a dumpster. He threatened that if this went public, they would lose the 60 grand forever, because if Garrison went to prison, he would declare bankruptcy. I asked why Kendrick lied about the dollar amount. She cried, saying Kendrick called her a coward, claiming that if she knew the real number, she never would have let him do it. Kendrick had bragged it was the perfect plan, because as the daddy's girl, it would look totally natural for her to demand her fair share. I heard a sliding glass door close in the background. She must have stepped out onto her balcony. She whispered that she had been such a fool. I told her she still had time to make it right. She cried that if she spilled everything, Kendrick would make her life a living hell. I told her she had to focus on what was legally right, not on who was going to throw a tantrum. She stayed silent for a long time. Then she agreed to meet at Harrison's office the next day. She showed up with a USB flash drive and printed copies of the emails. Harrison asked her to detail exactly how she accessed the data and sign an affidavit swearing it wasn't altered. Bridget spoke slowly, her voice trembling but never breaking. When Harrison asked her about the defamatory Facebook video, Bridget looked at the floor. She confessed she was the one who recorded it. I stared at her in shock. She explained that afternoon, her dad woke up from a nap. He called the nurse by her mother's name and asked about dinner. She said she panicked, genuinely thinking his mind was gone, and texted the clip to Garrison. Harrison asked what her motive was. She claimed she just wanted to ask her older brother if dad was mentally fit to sign contracts. She swore she wasn't the one who posted it online. I asked her if she knew Garrison was going to splice it to use as evidence for a legal guardianship battle. She said no. She claimed Garrison told her to keep it handy in case outsiders pressured their dad. I asked if outsiders meant me. Bridget nodded, a tear dropping onto the back of her hand. She admitted that at the time, she honestly believed I was isolating her father to steal the estate. She thought if they didn't have proof of his decline, they couldn't fight me in probate court. I asked her why. When she saw the video go viral with a caption calling me a thief, she didn't step up and clear my name. Bridget bit her lip. She admitted she secretly hoped the public backlash would force me to surrender the deeds and make the whole nightmare disappear. She said she convinced herself the ends justified the means. Harrison sternly corrected her. He stated no action becomes legal just because someone slaps A for the good of the family bumper sticker on it. Bridget buried her face in her hands and began to sob. She confessed she exploited her dad's weakest moment to secure her husband's shady investment, and apologized for calling me a meddler when she was the one who handed her father's dignity to Garrison to be trampled. I didn't hug her or offer automatic forgiveness. The wound was still bleeding. Rushing to forgive her would just be slapping a Band-Aid over a massive infection. I told her she had to publicly debunk the video. I demanded she post on Facebook, explaining the exact timestamp, the heavy sedatives, and how her brother manipulated the footage to incite a digital mob. She nodded, agreeing to do it, and promised to testify against Kendrick. She closed her eyes, finally giving up the negotiations. She said she would accept whatever consequences came her way. That evening, Bridget went to see Harlan. He didn't yell at her or demand the money back. He just walked her into his late wife's bedroom, stopping in front of the antique dresser that held her portrait and her pearl rosary. He opened a heavy cedar chest and pulled out 3 ancient leather-bound accounting ledgers. He dropped them on the dresser in front of his daughter. He told her she always thought she was the only one who got a raw deal. He revealed he had spent decades documenting exactly how unfair he had been to all of them. Bridget stared at the yellowed pages and started crying again. For the first time, the woman who thought she had to claw her way to an inheritance just to feel loved was facing a much darker truth. Her own family had weaponized her insecurity to control her. The 3 brown ledgers were stacked on the dresser, their edges stained with moisture. Harlan opened the first one, turning the pages slowly. Bridget sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, unable to meet the gaze of her mother's photograph. Harlan pointed to an entry written in faded blue ink. He said this was the year Garrison opened his supply depot. Garrison didn't have the cash flow to buy inventory. Harlan had sold a massive stockpile of premium oak he had been saving to remodel the house, and handed Garrison $30,000. Bridget's voice was barely a whisper when she asked if he wrote it down to collect the debt later. Harlan said he wrote it down so he wouldn't forget who he helped, but over the years, he forgot to force Garrison to actually learn how to run a business. He flipped forward. Another year, Garrison took a bath on a bad commercial contract, and Harlan diverted the warehouse rental income to bail him out. Another time, a delivery truck got repossessed, and Harlan bought it back. Next to every single entry, Harlan had written the exact same excuse. He is the oldest son. He has to keep the business afloat. Harlan closed the ledger and sighed. He said he thought supporting him was his duty, but all he really did was chain Garrison to the expectation of being the heir, while teaching him that his failures didn't matter. He taught Garrison that the family land would always be his personal ATM. Bridget looked up. She told her dad that if Garrison screwed up, it was Garrison's fault, and Harlan couldn't carry the weight of his son's crimes. Harlan replied he wasn't carrying Garrison's crimes. He was owning up to his own. He opened the second ledger. The very first page had the date of Bridget's wedding. He asked her if she remembered what he told her before she walked down the aisle. Bridget's eyes welled up. She recalled him saying she belonged to her husband's family now, and that Garrison and Vaughn would handle their own family's affairs. Harlan nodded. He explained he meant it as advice to focus on building her new life, but realized she processed it as an eviction notice from her own bloodline. Bridget smiled a broken smile. She said it wasn't just that one day. Whenever there was a crisis, he consulted Garrison first. If Bridget offered an opinion, he would dismiss her, saying married women shouldn't meddle in their father's business. Harlan looked at her and said he was wrong. That simple admission paralyzed Bridget. She had spent decades waiting to hear it. She turned her face away. She reminded him he gave her $80,000 for her condo. He acknowledged the money, but admitted cash doesn't erase a lifetime of making her feel like a runner-up to the boys. He confessed he thought financial equality was enough, failing to realize that a dismissive comment inflicts more permanent damage than an unequal inheritance. I sat quietly in the corner of the room. Bridget wiped her eyes. She admitted she used to tell herself that if her dad already viewed her as a stranger, she had every right to fiercely guard her slice of the pie. When Garrison told her I was getting the entire estate, all her childhood insecurities exploded, which was why she recorded that video. She lowered her head, confessing she sent it to Garrison, and when he weaponized it online to destroy me, she stayed quiet out of pure convenience. Harlan didn't raise his voice. He just asked her a question. He asked if the woman in the video had been her mother. Would she have ever sent a clip of her worst dementia episode to anyone to use as leverage? Bridget let out a gut-wrenching sob. She begged for his forgiveness. Harlan told her he was listening, but an apology doesn't delete a viral video off Facebook. She nodded, promising to debunk it on every community page, to explain she filmed it while he was heavily medicated, and that Garrison stripped the context to manipulate the town. Harlan looked at her with intense gravity. He warned her that doing the right thing now did not guarantee automatic forgiveness. He told her to do it simply because it was the right thing to do. Bridget tightened her lips and nodded. Harlan slid the third ledger over to me. It belonged to Vaughn. I didn't open it. I asked him if he wanted me to read it. He said he wanted me to understand how my husband became the man he is today. Vaughn's notebook barely contained any financial figures. It was filled with brief notes. Vaughn gave up his turn. Vaughn didn't complain. Vaughn did what his brother said. Harlan explained that when they were kids and got into fights, he always ordered Vaughn to back down because he was the easiest to handle. If Garrison stole a toy, Harlan would tell Vaughn to let him have it because he was the older brother. If Bridget threw a tantrum, Harlan forced Vaughn to apologize because Vaughn was more compliant. Suddenly, everything clicked. I finally understood why Vaughn believed down to his marrow that surrendering was the only way to achieve peace. Harlan's voice grew raspy. He confessed he always praised Vaughn for being a peacemaker, but never taught him that staying silent is just another way of giving bad people a hall pass. Bridget mumbled that, deep down, Vaughn was pitiful too. I replied coldly that being pitiful doesn't exempt a man from his duties as a husband and a father. Harlan agreed instantly. He noted that understanding the root of a trauma is meant to help fix it, not to excuse it. From the backyard, the whine of a table saw echoed from the cabinetry shop. Harlan pushed down on his thighs to stand up. He said people always preach about raising kids right from the cradle. He admitted he taught them hierarchy, but never taught them boundaries. He told Garrison to captain the ship, told Bridget she belonged below deck, and told Vaughn his greatest virtue was jumping overboard. He said all three of them grew up warped. Bridget asked if he was going to sell the commercial lot to keep Garrison out of prison. Harlan whipped around instantly. He said absolutely not. Bridget jumped, pointing out he just admitted it was partly his fault. He told her that taking responsibility for his bad parenting did not mean he was going to post Garrison's bail. Garrison bet the farm on a lie, and Harlan swore his land was not a premium insurance policy to cover his son's felonies. Bridget fell silent. Harlan sat back down. He said he would hire a ruthless defense attorney to ensure his son got a fair trial and wasn't railroaded by prosecutors. But he refused to lie under oath, and he refused to liquidate his life's work to plug Garrison's financial sinkhole. He stated this was the first time in his life he was going to stop using his checkbook to shield his kids from the consequences of their actions. He turned to Bridget and laid down a new boundary. He told her never to call him again asking about warehouse rents or property deeds. He said she could call him when she wanted to know how his health was or what he had for dinner. He ordered her to deal with her husband's secret bank accounts on her own and warned her not to expect him to pave over their potholes by selling off acres. Harlan's cell phone started buzzing. It was Vaughn. Harlan put it on speakerphone because his hands were shaking. Vaughn asked how his dad was feeling. Harlan said he was fine, noting Bridget had just told him they were digging through the past. Vaughn hesitated for a few seconds. He asked if his dad was furious with him. Harlan admitted he was, but added he was mostly furious with himself. He pointed out that Vaughn might not have known about the forged signature, but he knew Garrison wanted to pledge the land as collateral, yet he secretly emailed the official documents anyway. Dead silence echoed over the line. Harlan kept talking. He ordered Vaughn not to call and beg for forgiveness over the phone. He told him that when he finally found the courage to look him in the eye and take ownership of his actions without making a single excuse, then he could come visit. Vaughn mumbled a weak agreement. The call disconnected. I had no intention of driving back to Cleveland right away. Asking for forgiveness is like unlocking a door. Whether anyone actually walks through it depends entirely on what you do next. By late evening, Bridget prepared to leave. Before she walked out, she knelt in front of her mother's antique dresser. She didn't ask for a miracle. She just whispered to the photo that she had broken her dad's heart. Harlan watched her from the hallway without interrupting or rushing to comfort her. He knew some tears just have to run their course until the well is dry. I gathered the 3 ledgers. I asked him if he regretted signing the estate over to me. He shook his head. He said his only regret was keeping his eyes shut for so long. He admitted that if he had caved to pity and given the land back just to clear their debts, he would have just hit replay on the same tragic movie. Just then, Harrison called. His tone was dead serious. He told me the forensic results on the earnest money contract were in. I put him on speaker so Harlan could hear. Harrison revealed the signature was not written with a pen. The forensic lab confirmed it was a scanned image, digitally cropped and photoshopped onto the PDF. More importantly, they had tracked down the exact source document it was lifted from. It was snipped from an internal promissory note Harlan had signed to loan Garrison money 7 years ago. The next morning, I arrived at Harrison's office at the crack of dawn. The massive conference table was buried under a mountain of police reports and forensic audits, right next to a laptop displaying a meticulously mapped timeline of the fraud. Harrison slid the sheriff's cybercrime report across the desk, confirming the digital forgery. He explained the signature file was extracted from that old loan, its opacity tweaked in Adobe Acrobat to blend seamlessly with the white background of the PDF, and then printed in high-resolution color to fool Clayton. Harlan, sitting beside us, absorbed the blow without flinching. He merely muttered that it made sense why the signature looked so authentic, it almost made him doubt his own sanity. He noted that a forged piece of paper doesn't just steal a man's money, it tries to steal his mind. The digital forensics on the hard drive seized from Garrison's depot were absolute dynamite. The investigators found 3 distinct versions of the contract. The first was just the boilerplate text. The second featured a clumsily pasted signature. The third was the polished final draft. Harrison rhetorically asked if Garrison could pin the blame on a rogue employee. He immediately shot down his own question. Confirming the system logs traced the edits directly to Garrison's admin profile during a weekend when he was the only one in the building. The real estate agent who drafted the initial template went on the record stating she had never laid eyes on Harlan. Garrison had fed her the parcel numbers, lied that the family had reached a consensus, and paid her a flat fee to draft a standard earnest money agreement. The digital signature was grafted on by Garrison days later. The financial paper trail was equally damning. The second Garrison received the initial $80,000 wire. He didn't hold it in escrow. He immediately paid off a past-due invoice with a massive lumber supplier, covered his commercial overdrafts, and paid off an IRS tax penalty. He didn't keep a single dollar in reserve in case the deal fell through. That afternoon, Lorraine, Garrison's wife, walked into Harrison's office carrying the depot's physical accounting books and a terrifying list of hidden liabilities her husband had kept from her. She was a shell of a person. She confessed she knew cash flow was tight, but Garrison always blamed it on seasonal slowdowns. She swore she had no idea he had scammed Clayton and was horrified he had stolen the original deed from his dad's safe. When Harrison asked if she had ever seen the original title document, she broke down. She admitted that a few weeks prior, she spotted a thick envelope shoved under the passenger seat of Garrison's work truck. When she asked about it, Garrison snapped at her, claiming they were just old delivery manifests. Armed with her sworn statement, the sheriff's deputies executed a search warrant on the truck. They found the original, embossed property deed wrapped in a black plastic trash bag, stuffed inside a hidden compartment under the passenger seat. When Harlan heard the news, he closed his eyes for a very long time. He whispered the agonizing timeline to himself. Garrison had emptied the safe while Harlan was in the ER fighting for his life, hid the deed in his truck, and then possessed the sheer audacity to look his father in the eye and accuse his best friend Vernon of being a thief. That night, my phone rang. It was Vaughn. His voice was a panicked whisper. He told me Garrison had just demanded a meeting. I asked what Garrison wanted. Vaughn said Garrison was begging him to testify as a character witness for the defense. Garrison wanted Vaughn to swear under oath that I had spent months brainwashing their dad to block the sale to Clayton, and that I was the mastermind who orchestrated the ambush at the notary's office. I didn't say a word. Vaughn asked if I believed him. I told him I didn't, but warned him that Garrison threatened to tell the prosecutor it was Vaughn's idea to send the digital files to secure the mortgage. I looked over at Harlan, who was quietly listening from the armchair. I told my husband it was entirely his choice whether to attend the meeting. I told him not to ask me for instructions. I stated that going to listen to his brother wasn't the hard part. The hard part was deciding whose side he was going to stand on when the conversation ended. I hung up. I had spent 12 years putting out fires for Vaughn, accepting his pathological need to avoid conflict. This time, if our marriage was going to survive, he had to face down his older brother entirely on his own. Vaughn drove to the supply depot that same night. The warehouse was pitch black, except for a single fluorescent bulb flickering at the end of the hall. Garrison slapped the red-inked bank statements onto the metal desk. He warned Vaughn that if he went to prison, the depot would liquidate, 15 employees would lose their livelihoods, and Lorraine and the kids would end up on the street. Vaughn stared at the negative balances. He told Garrison that defrauding a buyer and forging their father's signature wasn't going to be fixed by passing the buck. Garrison screamed that he did it out of pure desperation. He unlocked his phone and shoved a pre-written statement in Vaughn's face. He ordered Vaughn to read it to the judge. He wanted Vaughn to testify that Alana brainwashed their dad in the cardiac ward, which caused Harlan to back out of a verbal contract and blindly sign the estate over to her. Vaughn jumped out of his chair. He asked Garrison if he was seriously demanding he commit perjury to frame his own wife. Garrison argued it wasn't perjury, it was just their strategic narrative. He claimed that if the judge suspected Alana exercised undue influence, the deed transfer would be frozen. Then, their dad could sell the lot, refund Clayton, and save the family. Vaughn stared at him like he was looking at a stranger. He asked exactly who they were saving. He asked if Garrison was trying to save himself at the cost of sending Alana to federal prison for extortion and procedural fraud. Garrison slammed his fist into a metal filing cabinet. He yelled that he was tossing Vaughn a life raft. He threatened that if he went down, he would testify that Vaughn sent the scanned files entirely on his own initiative. He asked Vaughn who he thought the detectives would investigate as the prime accomplice. Vaughn clenched his fists, finally confronting the terror that had dictated his entire life, the paralyzing fear of being hated by his own family. He admitted that for years. He thought bowing his head and obeying his older brother was the only way to keep the peace. Vaughn spoke with a cold, unfamiliar authority. He told Garrison that bowing down to him only taught him he could use other people's lives as poker chips. He said if he went down, he would go down, but he would not let Garrison destroy Alana. Vaughn turned his back and walked out of the depot. For the first time in 40 years, he didn't flinch. The next day, at 11 a.m., Vaughn walked voluntarily into the sheriff's precinct, accompanied by a defense attorney. He handed over his smartphone, his laptop, and the cloud backup containing the original digital scans. He confessed to emailing the sensitive documents to his brother, knowing his father had not authorized a commercial mortgage, though he vehemently denied knowing Garrison planned to forge a sales contract. His spontaneous confession and the mountain of digital evidence he provided severely mitigated his own legal exposure, but slammed the cell door shut on Garrison. Walking out of the precinct, Vaughn found me waiting in the parking lot. He kept a respectful distance. He told me he was deeply sorry for everything. He said he had read my deposition and didn't expect me to forgive him tonight, or even ask me to move back in. He just wanted to fix the damage he caused, even if there was no us left at the end of it. It was the very first time I had ever seen Vaughn take a bullet for his own mistakes, without inserting a but or playing the victim. I laid out 3 non-negotiable terms if he ever wanted to attempt a reconciliation. First, absolute financial transparency. Second, intense couples counseling to learn how to enforce boundaries with his relatives. Third, zero emotional blackmail using the kids or the town's gossip to force me to cave. Vaughn agreed to every single one. Following Vaughn's confession and the forensic extraction of Bridget and Clayton's phones, Clayton did a massive pivot. He finally accepted he was the victim of a con artist who sold him oceanfront property in Ohio. He formally withdrew his civil suit against my father-in-law and filed criminal charges against Garrison for aggravated felony fraud and forgery. Clayton even drove out to Vernon's house to issue a formal apology, writing a check to cover the emergency room bills and the smashed security camera. Vernon accepted the apology, but made Clayton sign a legally binding receipt. He joked that being polite didn't mean they shouldn't keep the paperwork straight. Bridget stayed true to her word. She posted a detailed video across all the local Columbus and Marysville Facebook groups, publicly exposing Garrison's manipulation. She confessed her father had been experiencing a temporary medically induced delirium and effectively cleared my name. She then forced Kendrick to sign a postnuptial agreement separating their assets and made him personally liable for the $60,000 crater he blew in their savings. She never again used the excuse of being the unloved daughter to justify her own greed. Garrison was indicted and dragged into the penal system. Desperate to negotiate a plea deal by paying restitution, his wife Lorraine was forced to liquidate the depot's entire inventory, sell the company trucks, and even auction off her own SUV just to scrounge up the $140,000 to pay Clayton back. Harlan didn't contribute a single dime to that debt. He did, however, retain a high-powered defense attorney to ensure his son wasn't overcharged by an aggressive prosecutor. Harlan told me one afternoon that he loved Garrison because he was his son, but it was exactly because he loved him that he had to stop shielding him from reality. He said when Garrison finally took ownership of the apocalypse he caused, then, and only then, would he be welcome back home. A year after that catastrophic hospital stay, the Midwest winter settled in. The massive oak tree in front of the stone ranch house had shed all its leaves. Harlan was in excellent health. The cabinetry shop was now run by an independent foreman under a strict, transparent contract. I audited the warehouse ledgers on the first of every month, ensuring every single dollar of rental income hit Harlan's personal account. That New Year's Eve, we gathered at the Marysville house. The dining table was loaded with prime rib, roasted potatoes, green bean casserole, and a fantastic Napa Valley Cabernet. At the head of the table, Harlan asked me to pull up one extra chair. I pointed out that nobody else was coming. He stared at the empty seat. He said nobody was sitting there tonight, but he wanted it there, so Garrison knew that if he ever paid his debts and learned to live an honest life, he would always have a place. Forgiveness doesn't mean ripping the front door open the exact second the person who hurt you knocks. Forgiveness simply means you don't brick the doorway shut. But the person who wants to walk through it has to hike the long, brutal road of accountability on their own 2 feet. Blood might give you a family tree, but your daily actions, your boundaries, and your respect are what truly determine who your family is.